Billionaire CEO Alexander Hayes visited his father's grave expecting solitude. But when he arrived, he found a small boy kneeling by the tombstone, quietly talking to the man buried beneath. The moment Alexander heard the boy's words, his entire world shattered. The sky was a deep shade of gray, a quiet wind rustling through the old cemetery as Alexander Hayes stepped out of his sleek black car. He adjusted the cuff of his tailored suit, exhaling as he walked down the familiar path. Row after row of graves, cold and forgotten. But his father's? That one was never forgotten. It had been 15 years since Charles Hayes had died, leaving behind a corporate empire and a son who was never enough for him. Alexander wasn't here to mourn. He didn't do grief, but he did do responsibility. And visiting his father's grave once a year, that was responsibility. His polished shoes crunched against the gravel as he approached the tombstone. But then he stopped. His body went rigid. Someone else was there. A small boy, no older than 6, knelt beside the grave. His tiny hands clutched a bouquet of wildflowers, not the expensive, perfectly arranged roses Alexander always brought. And he was talking, softly, gently, like he had done this 100 times before. Alexander's pulse pounded. Who was this child? And why was he talking to his father's grave, like he knew him? Before he could say a word, the little boy sniffled and whispered, the words that made Alexander's entire body freeze. "I miss you, Grandpa." Alexander's breath hitched. Grandpa? His father had no other family, no siblings, no secret children, no one. So who was this boy, and why? Why did he just call Alexander's father Grandpa? Alexander's mind spun. "I miss you, Grandpa." The little boy's words hit him like a freight train. He wasn't just some kid wandering through the cemetery. He was here for a reason. But how? How could this be possible? Alexander's father, Charles Hayes, had been a ruthless businessman, cold, calculating, unforgiving. He never spoke of family, never showed love, never had other children. So who was this boy? And more importantly, why did he think Charles Hayes was his grandfather? Alexander swallowed hard and took a slow step forward. The little boy must have heard him, because he looked up. And when he did, Alexander's breath caught in his throat. The boy had striking gray eyes, the same eyes Charles Hayes had, the same eyes Alexander had. His stomach twisted. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a coincidence. This boy was a Hayes. The child blinked up at him. "Who are you?" Alexander's throat felt tight. "I should be asking you that," he said, his voice lower than he intended. The boy hesitated, clutching the bouquet of wildflowers closer to his chest. "My name is Oliver," he said softly, "and this is my grandpa's grave." Alexander's pulse pounded. Oliver. The name felt foreign and familiar all at once. "You're wrong," Alexander said before he could stop himself. "Charles Hayes only had one son, me." Oliver frowned. His small brows knitted together. "That's not true," he whispered. Alexander's jaw tightened. "Yes, it is." Oliver shook his head. "My mommy told me all about Grandpa Charles." Alexander's chest tightened. "Mommy?" He took a slow breath. This was getting stranger by the second. "And where is your mother now?" Alexander asked carefully. Oliver hesitated. He bit his lip. Then, in a voice so small it almost broke something inside Alexander, he whispered, "She said she'd come back, but she never did." Alexander's heart stopped. His hands curled into fists. Who was this boy? And why was there a sinking feeling that this was only the beginning of something much bigger? Alexander stared at the little boy, his mind racing. She said she'd come back, but she never did. Something inside him tightened. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. Something was very, very wrong. He crouched down, leveling his gaze with Oliver's. "Where do you live, kid?" Oliver hesitated, gripping the bouquet of wildflowers. "In the shelter." Alexander's stomach dropped. Shelter? The boy was homeless? "What about your father?" he pressed. "Where is he?" Oliver's expression changed. His small hands curled into fists. "I don't have one," he said quietly. A strange, suffocating silence settled between them. Alexander's throat went dry. This boy, with Charles Hayes's eyes, with features that looked eerily like his own childhood photos, had no father, no mother, and yet he had been coming to this grave, believing Charles Hayes was his grandfather. "Who told you my father was your grandpa?" Alexander asked, his voice carefully controlled. "My mommy," Oliver said simply. Alexander's pulse pounded. "And what's her name?" The boy hesitated again. Then, in a whisper, he said, "Sophie." Alexander's entire body locked up. The air rushed from his lungs. Sophie. Sophie Carter. A name he hadn't heard in 7 years. A name he had spent years trying to forget. His fingers curled into fists. Sophie was his first love. His only love. The one woman who had ever gotten past his walls. The one woman he had once imagined a future with. And the same woman who had vanished without a word, disappearing from his life overnight. 7 years ago. The same age as this boy. A horrible, impossible thought crept into Alexander's mind. It couldn't be. It couldn't. But when he looked at Oliver again, really looked at him, he suddenly saw it. The shape of his jaw, the curve of his nose, the piercing Hayes family eyes. His own blood froze. And for the first time in his life, Alexander Hayes, billionaire CEO, the man who controlled everything, felt like the ground had just been ripped out from beneath him. Because there was only one possible explanation. Oliver wasn't just some lost boy. He was Alexander's son. Alexander's world tilted. The realization hit him like a train. Oliver, this small, innocent boy, kneeling at his father's grave, was his son, his own flesh and blood, and he had never known, never been told, never even suspected. His heart pounded as he stared at Oliver, who had no idea that everything had just changed. "You said your mother's name is Sophie?" Alexander's voice came out rough, barely above a whisper. Oliver nodded, looking slightly confused at the intensity in Alexander's gaze. "Where is she now?" Alexander asked, his hands clenching into fists. Oliver hesitated. Then his little shoulders slumped. "I don't know," he whispered. "She said she'd come back, but—" He looked away, kicking at the dirt. "She never did." Alexander's jaw locked. 7 years ago, Sophie had disappeared from his life without a word. No calls, no messages, no explanation. And now, standing in front of him, was a living, breathing reminder of the past she had stolen from him. His chest tightened painfully. How could she do this? How could she hide his child from him? Alexander took a slow breath, forcing himself to stay calm. "How long have you been at the shelter?" he asked carefully. Oliver frowned, counting on his fingers. "A few weeks, I think." A few weeks, which meant Sophie had been with him before that. So where the hell was she now? Had she abandoned him? The thought sent a sharp wave of anger through Alexander. He had always believed Sophie was different, that despite everything, despite her leaving, she was still a good person. But now he wasn't so sure. He looked at Oliver again, really looked at him. The kid had been surviving on his own. No home, no family, no protection. And yet somehow he had ended up here, at Charles Hayes's grave, still believing in a grandfather he had never met, still hoping for a family that had never known he existed. Something inside Alexander broke. This kid was his, and he had nowhere to go. The thought of leaving him here alone in that shelter was unbearable. "Oliver," Alexander said, his voice steady now, "what if I told you I knew your grandfather?" Oliver's eyes widened. "You did?" Alexander nodded. "I did," he swallowed. "And what if I told you I might be able to help you find your mom?" Oliver's expression shifted. Hope flickered in his young eyes. "You can?" he whispered. Alexander's chest tightened. "Yeah, kid," he said. "I can." But deep down, he already knew. Finding Sophie wouldn't just give Oliver answers. It would give him answers too. Answers he had been denied for 7 years. And this time, he wouldn't let her run. Oliver's eyes lit up at Alexander's words. "You can find my mom." There was so much hope in his voice that it made something tighten in Alexander's chest. Because for the first time in his life, Alexander wasn't thinking about corporate deals, stock prices, or his carefully controlled world. He was thinking about this boy, his son, and he wasn't about to let him down. Alexander slowly stood up, brushing the dust off his suit. "Come on," he said, holding out his hand. "Let's get you out of here." Oliver hesitated. His small fingers gripped the bouquet of wildflowers, the only thing he had to give to the grandfather he never met. Then, as if making a decision, he carefully placed the flowers at the base of the tombstone. "Bye, Grandpa," he whispered. Alexander swallowed hard. Then, without another word, Oliver slipped his tiny hand into his. And just like that, Alexander Hayes, billionaire CEO, a man who thought he had everything, walked out of the cemetery with the one thing he never knew he was missing: his son. The drive back into the city was quiet. Oliver sat in the passenger seat of Alexander's luxury car, his small hands fidgeting in his lap. "So," Alexander said, breaking the silence, "you said your mom was supposed to come back. Do you remember where she went?" Oliver nodded. "She went to find work. She said she'd be back soon. But—" he looked down. "She never came." Alexander's jaw tightened. Something wasn't right. Sophie wasn't perfect, but she wasn't the type to abandon her child. If she hadn't come back, something must have happened. And Alexander intended to find out exactly what. He reached for his phone and dialed a number. "Marcus," he said. When his assistant picked up, "Sir, I need you to run a search on someone. Sophie Carter. Find out where she was last seen, who she was with, and what the hell happened to her." There was a slight pause, then understood. "I'll have the information within the hour." Alexander hung up and exhaled slowly. If Sophie was in trouble, he would find her. If she had betrayed him, he would make her answer for it. But either way, Oliver wasn't going back to that shelter. He was staying with him. Oliver yawned beside him, his little head resting against the seat. Alexander glanced at him, something unfamiliar stirring inside him. This kid, his kid, trusted him. And for the first time in his life, Alexander Hayes felt something more powerful than all the money, all the power, all the success he had ever known: responsibility. No matter what happened next, he wasn't letting Oliver go. Not now, not ever,